All right. So as we turn to the first session, let me explain the structure of the conference. Each session is going to have two presenters, or one presenter and one respondent. The respondent will introduce a presenter, then deliver his or her response and moderate the discussion with the presenter and the Q&A with the audience. I want to remind you that if you need to do other things, or you want to have a break between the sessions are not going to have a formal break. We're going to continue one after the other. You can always come back to the session. There shouldn't be any problem as far as the Zoom link is concerned. So with this, let's turn to session number 1 on Jewish life among the Muslims in the Middle Ages. Professor Krakowski, please take charge.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's a real pleasure and honor for me to introduce Professor Mark Cohen, who is the Chaduri Zilka Professor of Jewish Civilization in the Near East and Professor of Near Eastern Studies Emeritus at Princeton University. He is the author of a wide range of works on the Geniza documents, on medieval Jews and Judaism in the Islamic world. And he is also the scholar who has trained more scholars in the United States within this subfield than any other. So most of my colleagues and my own mentors and teachers were trained by Professor Cohen. And I'm really delighted to introduce him to speak about Jewish life among the Muslims in the Middle Ages. So I'm gonna turn the floor over to you, Mark, and mute myself, and then I'll give a response after.
Thank you, Eve. Am I being heard? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. I thought I wanted to make sure I was unmuted. Thank you, Chava, for inviting me to this very important conference, and my welcome also to those of you whom I know and those of you whom I'm meeting for the first time, and to many of you who are my former students. I just will preface my remarks by saying that I unfortunately came down with a head cold, so I may from time to time take a Kleenex and blow my nose. Our knowledge of Jewish life among Muslims in the Middle Ages begins with the Prophet Muhammad's settlement in the North Arabian oasis town of Medina. There he met Jewish tribes and absorbed much about their religion and practices. Despite hostility on both sides, the Prophet admitted those Jews who wished into the membership of the Islamic community. Most of the Jews, however, met the new religion of Islam with hostility, and Islam spread to Spain and to Southwest Asia. A special relationship, legal and social, was formed between the Muslims and non-Muslims, including Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and others. Legal and narrative sources in Arabic define a checkered relationship between Muslims and the subordinate non-Muslim peoples. Our main knowledge of Jewish life among Muslims in the Middle Ages relies principally on the manuscripts found at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries in a synagogue in Old Cairo, collectively referred to as the Cairo Geniza. The Geniza trove numbers at present estimate approximately 400,000 fragments. Of these, the vast majority are pages from literary texts reflecting the types of subjects Jews read and studied. The other texts, estimated at as many as 40,000 self-contained items, are not religious writings at all. They constitute material from everyday life. They date mostly from the 10th to the mid-13th centuries, the so-called classical Geniza period. The documentary Geniza, as it was called by S.D. Goethe, includes letters, court records, marriage contracts, deeds of divorce, wills, documents concerning pious trusts, business contracts, merchant letters and accounts, book lists, lists of recipients of charity, registers of gifts for charitable purposes, and much more. Filled with details of people's everyday life, these sources reveal aspects of economic, social, and family life, as well as of material culture and individual mentalities that were previously largely unknown. With the benefit of the documentary Geniza, we have direct and unmediated access to those realia and a basis on which to evaluate Jewish life in the medieval Islamic world, from Muslim Spain and the lands of the Mediterranean Rim, from Southwest Asia and Palestine, even from Sicily, Byzantium, and the west coast of India during the Middle Ages. The Geniza confirms that Jews and other non-Muslims were granted security, aman in Arabic, and the status of protected people, ahl al-dhimma or dhimmis. Freedom of religion, of residence, and of commerce were made conditional on non-Muslims paying a head tax called Jizya in Arabic and prescribed in the Quran in the 9th surah, as well as obeying restrictive, often humiliating laws incorporated into the so-called Pact of Umar. This document was ascribed to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who reigned from 634 to 644, but it was apparently compiled in the 9th century. Throughout the Islamic Empire, the Jews were organized into self-governing communities. Most of our information comes from Egypt, the home of the Geniza. Until the 1060s, the Fatimid Caliph recognized the head of the yeshiva in Jerusalem, called the Gaon, as head of the Jews of the Fatimid Empire. The change took place in the latter third of the 11th century when the leadership shifted to Cairo in the person of the head of the Jews, Ra'is al-Yahud, in Hebrew, Nagid. The head of the Jews was appointed by the caliph upon recommendation of the influential members of the Jewish community and exercised many of the prerogatives formerly reserved to the Gaon. The head of the Jews frequently succumbed to political infighting, and the office was not stabilized until the time of Abraham, the son of Moses Maimonides. Abraham lived from 1186 to 1237. Jewish communities all over the Islamic world had leaders approved by the Islamic authorities, as well as functionaries who supervised Jewish courts and other needs, such as the distribution of charity. The conquering Arabs, on the other hand, were ill-equipped to administer their own new state apparatus. So non-Muslim self-government was frequently paralleled by the service of non-Muslims in the Islamic bureaucracy. Even when Muslims began to assume administrative control of the empire, dhimmis continued to serve in positions of authority, some of them rising very high at court and in the governing apparatus. This placed non-Muslims in situations where they exercised power over Muslims, much to the consternation of rulers, Muslim clerics, and Muslims who coveted such high rank for themselves. Not infrequently, Jewish government officials suffered blowback, the worst Jewish case being the assassination in 1066 of the politically controversial Jewish vizier of Granada and the massacre of the male members of the Jewish community. Generally in this society, different religions and ethnic groups maintained awareness of their differences and of the supremacy of Islam. Within this hierarchy, necessarily based on religion, Muslims were at the top. Jews and Christians occupied the bottom rung. Sometimes differences of religion spurred conflict. For instance, when Jews and Muslims lived in the same courtyard house, and religious and social differences led to friction. Most of the time, however, as long as everyone abided by the rules, people could, and more often than did, relate, more often than not, did relate to one another on a day-to-day basis with relatively little friction. In places where religion mattered very little, notably the urban marketplace, confessional hierarchy was nearly completely set aside. Jews and Muslims did business together and even formed partnerships. Jewish and Muslim traders could relate to one another as near equals because the marketplace was governed by a shared custom of the merchants. Muslim and Jewish legists found ways of assimilating these customs into Islamic and Jewish law, respectively, in order to keep a pace of developments that had little to do with religious principles. We see this, for instance, when comparing Jewish merchant letters found in the Geniza with letters of Muslim traders in Arabic exhumed from caches of Egyptian papyri. Apart from international trade, Jews and other dhimmis could be found in nearly all categories of Muslim society, working alongside Muslims who outranked them and as adherents of the religions of the ruler. They functioned as artisans, government clerks, physicians, and in a number of other professions common to Muslims. Informally, the educated elite shared intellectual pursuits such as Greek philosophy with Muslim counterparts. Jewish and Muslim physicians trained in medicine originating in the Greek language and translated into Arabic, practiced medicine in interdenominational settings, and many ministered to the sick in the same hospitals. In these endeavors, Jews and Muslims manifested loyalties of category, to use the terminology coined by Islamic historian Roy Muttaheda, one of my teachers, that straddled the Muslim, non-Muslim divide and mitigated the discrimination inherent in the ever-present religious hierarchy. Jews had confidence in the Muslim judicial system. The Geniza and the responsa literature, including the responsa of Maimonides, record multiple examples of resort by Jews to Muslim courts, where they often received a fair hearing. This preference for state courts is seen, for example, when Jewish merchants quarreled among themselves over business matters, and when Jewish women appealed to Muslim rather than to Jewish courts for redress of grievances against their Jewish husbands. Of course, there were exceptions to the rule of peaceful interplay between Jews and Muslims, but compared to their distant brethren, the Jews of Christian Europe, the Jews of Islam rarely suffered qua Jews in the Islamic world. The well-known persecutions of the Middle Ages, such as the destructive assault on dhimmis and their houses of worship by the so-called Mad Caliph, Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who reigned from 996 to 1021, were aimed at non-Muslims as a group and not at Christians or Jews alone. The same is true of the devastating conquest of North Africa and Islamic Spain in the 1140s by the religiously rigorous Almohads, in which thousands of Jews and Christians were killed and thousands converted to Islam under duress or fled. The Almohads, it should be said, targeted lax Muslims as well. As stated, with the exception, such as the above-mentioned crackdown against the Jews of Granada in 1066, and similarly painful episodes in Yemen and late medieval Morocco, Jewish dhimmis were allowed to live peacefully in the religiously and socially heterogeneous world of medieval Islam. Furthermore, Jews were more culturally embedded in the society around them than their brethren living in medieval Christian Europe. The latter focused their cultural and literary interests on traditional texts like the Bible, the Talmud, and other legal writings, and synagogue liturgy and synagogue poetry, in which they frequently bemoaned their exile from the Holy Land. The Jews of the Muslim world took the cultural and literary interests just enumerated in new directions, while at the same time cultivating novel interests that they adopted and adapted from the Muslim society in which they live. Just as Muslims studied the language of the Quran, Jews studied Hebrew, the language of the Bible, seeking to understand the structure of the Hebrew verb. Like Arabic, the Hebrew of the Bible was written originally without vowel signs. Muslims created a vowel system adapting symbols from Syriac, partly to aid newly converted non-Arab Muslims learn the Arabic language. Young Jews learning Hebrew in order to recite the prayers and read other religious texts composed in Hebrew needed vowel signs too to aid their own study. The Geniza has preserved pages in vocalized Hebrew from children's illustrated primers. Of course, the language the Jews spoke was Arabic, a form of the language similar to the informal Arabic spoken by Arabs. Inspired by Arab, new form of Hebrew verse, which flourished most robustly in Islamic Spain. The poetry had rhyme, like the older Jewish liturgical verse, but it introduced meter, following the quantitative model of Arabic prosody, which was based on the length of syllables. In place of post-biblical Rabbinic Hebrew, the Spanish Jewish poets relied exclusively on the Hebrew of the Bible, just as Arab poets favored classical Arabic of the Quran. Religious poetry for the synagogue was not abandoned, although it incorporated philosophical and ascetic themes influenced by Islamic philosophy and mysticism. Most characteristic, the new Jewish poetry and its acculturative mode, however, was that it featured for the first time entirely secular themes such as romantic love, wine, nature, and even war. The new Hebrew poetry, which blossomed most abundantly in Islamic Spain and flourished as well in other parts of the Muslim world, gave the entire period of Jewish embeddedness in the medieval Arabic world, reflected in the Cairo Geniza, its famous moniker, the Golden Age. Unfortunately, in today's Middle East and in parts of Europe, especially France, the kind of coexistence that marked Jewish-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages is marred by conflict and alienation. Jewish memory of the Holocaust, a tragedy anchored in European Christian anti-Semitism, not in Islam, has all but blotted out memories of Jewish embeddedness in majority Muslim society in the Middle Ages. Hopefully one day in the future, Jews and Muslims will regain something of the past when, despite periodic dark episodes, Jews shared language, culture, and mutual tolerance that allowed them to live most of the time in peace and mutual respect with their Muslim neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to respond now. Thank you so much to Chava and the other organizers of the conference for inviting me to participate. And thanks to Mark Cohen for the opportunity to respond to this lucid and very nuanced overview of Jewish life under Islamic rule during the Middle Ages. Mark's talk focused mainly on a particular time and place, namely Fatimid and Ayyubid Egypt and Syria between about 1000 and 1250, which is special because we have much better and richer evidence in this time and place for Jewish life, and in some respects for social history in general, than we do from anywhere else in the medieval Islamic Middle East, which is thanks to the Geniza documents, which, as Mark explained, offer us an intimate and immediate portrait of ordinary Jews' everyday lives, which is totally unlike the evidence that we have from anywhere else. So the picture that this material gives us, which is corroborated by most of our other evidence for the period, as Mark has just sketched it, is really two-sided. So on the one hand, this was a world in which religion was really central to people's social identities, and in which Islam was the politically and socially dominant religion. So being Jewish or Christian marked people in key ways as subordinate to Muslims, both in the eyes of Islamic states and of society in general. So that's one side. But on the other hand, in practice, religion was not a totalizing social category. So for example, Jews were not exclusively or completely defined by their Jewishness. And most significantly, this was manifestly a world, and I'm quoting now in Mark's words, of a shared language, culture, and mutual tolerance that allowed Jews to live most of the time in peace and mutual respect with their Muslim neighbors. Mark's talk put this political model into context by comparing it favorably to Jews' status in Christian Europe during the same period. And I want to just share a slide here, so I'm going to try to do that. Chav, if you can just let me know if this is visible. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the reason I wanted to share the slide is because Mark literally wrote the book on this subject, comparing Jews' status in Christian Europe and the Islamic Middle East in the Middle Ages. It's called Under Crescent and Cross. It's a classic in this field, and I warmly encourage all of you to read it to get a much fuller picture of this comparison. In my brief response, I'm going to echo Mark's conclusions and complement them by adding a few other comparative footnotes to the picture that he sketched. So first of all, besides comparing the Geniza evidence to life in contemporary Europe, as Mark did in his talk and as he does more fully in this book, we can also think about what Jewish life and status looked like in the Middle East itself before Islam. So in other words, what difference did the development of Islam and the Islamization of the region make to Jews' identity and status? And here too, I suggest that we can posit a similarly dual or two-sided portrait. On the one hand, it's important to note that the idea of a social and political order carved up along religious lines did not originate in the Islamic period. Such a model had already developed in late antiquity under the Christian Roman emperors. And in fact, some of the key features of the dhimmi model, which as Mark explained, defined Jews and Christians as protected but second-tier subjects within Islamic states by virtue of their religion, this model in major ways closely echoed late Roman legislation about Jews, pagans, and non-Orthodox Christians. So for example, one of the best known aspects of the dhimmi codes is that in theory, Jews and Christians living under Islamic rule were not supposed to build new churches or synagogues. So one version of the Pact of Umar, which Mark mentioned, reads, and this is supposedly voiced by Christians, but this would have applied in theory to Jews and Christians. We shall not build in our cities or in their neighborhoods new monasteries, churches, convents, or monk cells, nor shall we repair by day or by night such of them as fall in ruins or are situated in the quarters of the Muslims. So the idea is churches and synagogues that were already there before the Islamic conquests can stand, but they can't be repaired and new ones can't be built. So I should add, in practice, this was not actually what happened, but this is in theory part of what dhimmi status meant. If we turn to the Theodosian Code from the early 5th century, we find almost the exact same provision vis-a-vis synagogues alone under Christians' rule. It seems right that in the future, none of the synagogues of the Jews shall either be indiscriminately seized or put on fire. Okay, so synagogues shouldn't be destroyed, but no synagogue shall be constructed from now on, and the old ones shall remain in their state. So pretty much the same legislation. So this is just one small example, but my point is that the dhimmi model was not entirely novel. It was a direct continuation of a political and social model that had developed already with the Christianization of the Middle East during the late Roman period. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the general scholarly consensus that's emerged in recent years is that Islamization probably did intensify this model in practice, in the sense that religious identity probably gradually came to hold greater and more universal social meaning for Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike during the Islamic Middle Ages than it had in the pre-Islamic Middle East. And this brings me to the second point that I'd like to add, which has to do with this intensification of religion as a marker of social identity. Part of what's really interesting about this shift, at least to me, is that it didn't simply affect Jews in terms of their subordinate status vis-a-vis others, it also helped to transform Judaism from the inside. As Mark noted, Jews were deeply, and here I'm quoting, culturally embedded in the Islamic Middle East. As he puts it, they adopted and adapted literary and cultural genres and categories from Islamic texts and traditions. And some of the latest work that is now happening in this field is considering some of the less obvious ways that this process helped to transform even of what we think of as the most fundamental aspects of Judaism. So Mark discussed, for example, poetry, which is a well-known example of this phenomenon, but he alluded in his talk to other kind of less obvious practices that we may think of as, really core traditional practices of Judaism, which also are part and parcel of this process. The example he gave was the vocalization of the Hebrew Bible. I'll just give another one. So take the Babylonian Talmud, the cornerstone of Rabbinic Judaism. It's a late ancient text, so it comes from before the Islamic period, but it's become increasingly clear that Jews probably fixed the Talmud in writing and disseminated it across the Middle East during the first Islamic centuries in the context of an Arabic Islamic literary revolution that was happening during the same period. And oh yeah, I have a slide. So this is just to give you something to look at. This is a book list, which some students in my undergraduate seminar happen to be looking at this week, one of hundreds that we have from the Geniza. This one actually has been published. And it's just really interesting because it's a list of books probably belonging to somebody's private library, which intersperses Judeo-Arabic titles with many, many Jewish and Rabbinic titles. And I just showed you this one, some volumes of the Talmud, Sachim, and Eruvin. So these are very much this is an intellectual world in which Rabbinic Judaism sort of took shape textually and was disseminated textually as part of similar processes happening among other groups. To take another somewhat different example, even the most onerous aspects of dhimmi status also affected Jewish communities from the inside. So for example, take the poll tax, which Mark talked about. The Geniza shows us that the poll tax really was a significant burden on Jews in medieval Egypt. But it also had the indirect effect of strengthening Jewish communal cohesion. And the reason that I chose this example is that another important work of Mark's, Poverty and Charity in the Jewish Community of Medieval Egypt, demonstrates that the Jews whom the Geniza shows us maintained extensive communal charity apparatuses in which, among other things, wealthy Jews or wealthier Jews paid the poll tax for poorer Jews. A system that had the effect of binding together Jews of different social and economic classes around their shared Jewishness. So the poll tax was absolutely an external imposition and a burden, but it also had significant internal effects on Jewish life beyond just subjugation, which we probably would not know about without the Geniza documents, which brings me to my final comparative point. And it's really a question, namely, how representative is the picture that we get from the Geniza of Jewish life in the medieval Islamic world more broadly? Unsurprisingly, medieval Islam was not a monolithic or a static system or set of practices with uniform or unchanging social effects across the centuries and across the whole region. Even in Egypt itself, there's evidence that things may have changed considerably from the mid-13th century on under the Mamluks, and that things got worse for Jews and Christians who were increasingly marginalized, increasingly subject in reality to the Dhimmi codes, which maybe had not been enforced previously. So the Geniza may give us a window onto a social world quite different from the one that came after it. In my view, this impression probably does have reality behind it, but still I want to close by considering whether some of this apparent deterioration may also be an artifact of the evidence that happens to survive. So for example, our evidence for Jewish life in the Mamluk period comes mainly from Islamic literary works, although it's worth noting that there is a smaller corpus of Geniza documents from the late Mamluk period, which reappears after kind of a long period in which we don't have much. Still, most of what we know comes from literary writings. So how much does our sense of this history and of things getting dramatically worse depend on this shift in evidence? What would our picture of Jewish life elsewhere in the medieval Middle East and in other time periods look like if we could sketch it, not just from literary works and polemical writings and legal codes, but from, many other Genizas that did not survive, or at least that we don't know about, but that might have given us a fine-grained picture of the same kind that we have for this time and place of what things really looked like and how things really worked in everyday life on the ground. Thank you. So should I take the questions? Okay.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I don't actually see anything in the chat at the moment. So if anybody has questions, please put them in.
The questions are in the Q&A.
Oh, they're in the Q&A. That explains it. Okay.
And there's quite a few.
So I think some of these are for Mark. So Mark, why don't I direct the ones that are for you first? So we have from Ali Al-Batati, is not paying jizya kind of discriminative, paying for your security?
I didn't catch that.
The question is whether the jizya is a form of discrimination.
Certainly it's a form of discrimination. The poll tax, however, is the only legal act of discrimination that's found in the Quran. The Act of Umar came later, and the jizya is not even mentioned here because it had a Quranic basis. There's no need to include it in the Act of Umar. Yes, it was indeed, but as Eve has shown, the Jewish community managed to overcome its burden for the poorer Jews by contributing to a community effort to make life easier for them.
Okay, thanks. So then the next question is about the Theodosian Code, which I mentioned, whether the ban on construction of new synagogues was enforced. We don't know to what extent, but many of the synagogues that survive that have been sort of recovered by archaeology probably come from after that law was passed. So it likely was no more enforced universally than the Islamic version that I started with. Okay, I am going to punt this to Mark because it's really not about the Middle Ages. Is there any organization or individuals in the Islamic world, aside from the Abrahamic Accord nations, attempting to reinstitute some of the interrelations that did exist during the Middle Ages with the purpose of reestablishing cultural or social interaction? I wonder if maybe some of our panelists who work on more modern and contemporary history might also want to chime in about this.
Well, there are individuals and small groups of people on both sides of the conflict who endeavor to create warmer and more positive relations with the Jews. There are also institutes and intellectual programs in Europe which place emphasis on bringing Jews and Muslims closer together. The Abraham Accords are very interesting. They deal with lands which have very relatively little history of Jewish-Muslim interaction. Would have been interesting if Saudi Arabia would have been part of the picture, and that would have been, of course, an area where Jews had a presence in the Middle Ages at the very, very beginning, as I said, in Muhammad's time.
Okay, we have a question here from Rabbi Michael Hilton. To what extent, this is for Mark, to what extent did the situation of Jews that Mark Cohen described lay the foundation for later differences of custom and practice between Ashkenazim and Sephardim?
I don't totally understand that question. Do you, Eve?
No, I wonder if, I'm not sure. I mean, I think certainly the intellectual and textual practices that we both discussed that arise out of a kind of common culture in the region make their way into later practice and custom, but I'm not sure beyond that. This was Rabbi Michael Hilton, so if you're in the audience, please feel free to expand. But in the meantime, I'll move on to the next one. Okay, Mark, can you speak to the extent to which there were attempts to convert Jews to Islam or Christianity? I am thinking here of the apocryphal anti-Semitic text, the Letter of Rabbi Samuel, which purports to be an account written by a Moroccan Jew in the 10th century about his conversion to Catholicism, and wondering about how and when Jews in the Islamic world might have converted either to Christianity or Islam.
Surprisingly, there was quite a bit of conversion of Jews to Islam in the Middle Ages. Largely, but not exclusively, at the top of society, where Jews exchanged intellectual interests with Muslims and found little difference between the two and decided to join the religion of the masters rather than be members of the subordinate minority. Jews found, many Jews found in Islam an attractive alternative to Judaism, and certainly it brought them more material advantages than remaining in the society in which they were born. There were, of course, major conversions of Jews to Islam under pressure. And the most famous example of this is the Almohad persecutions in North Africa and in Spain, after the Almohads of North Africa conquered Spain, and many, many thousands of Jews and Christians lost their lives. Many fled, and interestingly enough, to Christian lands where at that time they felt more secure. So yes, there was a great deal of contact between Jews and Muslims, and it often led to a choice of the major or master religion over the subordinate religion.
Okay, now we have a very interesting question from Lawrence Fine. Can you speak to the question of the ways in which and degree to which Jewish intellectual culture may have influenced Islamic culture in Spain? That is, to what extent was influence a two-way street?
Culture in Spain in the Middle Ages is often referred to as a convivencia, culture of living together, culture of sharing intellectual pursuits together. The influence, however, was largely in the direction of Islamic influence upon Judaism and Jewish cultural phenomena, such as the poetry that I spoke about. There was a large movement of Christians in Spain to Islam, and that created tensions within the Christian community and martyrdoms of those who were considered resistors to conversion to Islam. But in Spain, the direction of influence was principally from Islam into Judaism. And Jews shared interest in Islamic philosophy and discussed Islamic philosophy with Muslim philosophers, but the intellectual product of this was mainly visible in the Jewish philosophical community rather than in the Muslim community. Muslims were aware of Jewish philosophical interests, particularly of great Jewish philosophers like Maimonides, who himself was integrated into Muslim intellectual society. And as to his influence on Islam, that is not compared to the influence his philosophy had on Christian thinkers, such as Thomas Aquinas in medieval Europe.
Okay. So now we have a question, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, from Seamus Martin, which has to do with Jews fighting in Muslim armies. And it's based on a reference about the Battle of Uhud, but the question is more generally, were Jews allowed to fight in Muslim armies? And if so, to what extent, if at all, did this give them preferential treatment over other Dhimmis?
I'm not aware of situation in which Jews join Muslim armies in fighting against the enemies of Islam. We have a famous example of a Jewish warrior in Samuel Nagid ibn Agrela, a great poet and vizier of the Muslim kingdom of Granada in the middle of the 12th century, and he is said to have been a leader or even the chief of the Islamic army, and that would be an interesting example, but a very rare one of Jews in the Muslim military mode.
Okay, thanks. So now from, again, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Michaela or perhaps Michaela Spengenberg, why do you, this is going back to the poll tax, why do you believe the jizya is discriminatory rather than a tax which corresponds to zakat, which under those regimes was collected by the state from Muslims? Wouldn't the lack of jizya have unfairly privileged non-Muslims financially?
Could you repeat that, please? It's a little slow.
Yes, sorry. Why do you believe, this is going back, I believe the first or one of the first questions you answered was about whether the jizya was discriminatory. So this question is, why do you believe that the jizya is discrimination rather than simply a parallel to the zakat, which under those regimes was collected by the state from Muslims? Wouldn't the lack of a jizya have unfairly privileged non-Muslims financially?
Well, from the Jewish point of view, it certainly was discriminatory. It was the Jews within their own communities raised funds that could be said to be similar to the zakat, benefiting society, benefiting Muslim society. An example of this would be renting houses for, or using the rent from houses for various communal purposes. But from the Jewish point of view, as a minority, the jizya was certainly considered to be discriminatory, whereas in the Muslim community, I don't believe that the zakat was considered discriminatory, but rather as an obligation to the community, to the Muslim community. I hope that addresses the question. I'd add that the jizya was a continuation of discriminatory taxes upon the Jews in the Byzantine Empire. And so for the Jews, it wasn't much of a change. It was most burdensome on the poor.
Okay, I should add, Chava, I'm not sure what time, if we're taking a break or at what time.
No, you have plenty of time, because this session is scheduled to go all the way to 11:30, so we have plenty of time to cover. Not a problem. If you don't mind, I would like to suggest one more follow-up to this question of taxation. Mark, could you comment on the land taxes that were imposed on Jews and their impact on Jewish economic activity, the shift basically from agricultural and farming type of activity more to trade and commerce?
That's exactly true. In the previous period, pre-Islamic period, where Jews were primarily living from agricultural pursuits. It's a period of time in which Southwest Asia and the medieval period, the lands of the Byzantine Empire and the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, Jews were land-based. It was the coming of Islam that transformed the Jewish community into a predominantly commercial society, traveling great distances from the far west to the far east. And under such circumstances, they became a largely urbanized culture, whereas before that time they were agricultural, and therefore the taxation and the internal expenditures of the community came from commercial rather than from agricultural endeavors.
Okay, so this is a question that we could probably spend the rest of the time answering, but it's from Justine Walden. I'm interested in understanding what was occurring on the ground in terms of intermixing, exchange, and practical tolerance. Were urban areas in Islam segregated by religious adherence? So did Christians and Jews live in specific quarters, or were residence patterns more interspersed? And what is the evidence that speaks to this question?
That's a very, very good question. Really ought to be addressed here, as been alluded to before. Whereas in Christian Europe, Jews lived in definite quarters or streets, separating them off from their Christian neighbors. We know from the Geniza that there were no real exclusively Jewish quarters. Jews lived in many different quarters of the city and along the same lines or in parallel. Muslims lived in Jewish quarters. Muslims and Jews in Jewish quarters lived in I wouldn't call them Jewish quarters, I would call them Jewish neighborhoods, lived sometimes in the same courtyard house. And this sometimes led to friction because of differing religious customs. But by and large, the Jews were spread widely across the Muslim social world and socially defined living places, rather than being segregated off as they were in Europe into what later became or later were called ghettos. And this is one of the ways in which Judaism was influenced by Islam, that is through direct connections between Jews and Muslims living at close quarters in the Muslim urban space.
I just want to add one footnote, which is that there's some scholar right now working actually on housing patterns, specifically interreligious housing patterns as demonstrated in Geniza legal deeds about real estate, named Moshe Yegur. So this is something, since the questioner asked about evidence, there's a lot of very rich evidence in the Geniza specifically for this kind of question, of which residence pattern is actually one that is being looked at right now. Okay, the next question, Mark, this is a short question, but perhaps the answer will not be short. What do you think of the surge of post 9/11 dismissal of convivencia as a myth?
Well, it's not surprising. Even before 9/11, Spanish scholars in Spain were questioning the whole concept of what they called convivencia. But if I understand the question or the background of the question, the conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslims have questioned the historical interplay between Jews and I would add Christians and Muslims. And not to speak of the conflict between Muslims and Jews in the state of Israel, which is certainly questioned the whole concept of a sharing and living together in cultural interchange that was characteristic of most of the period of the Middle Ages, and probably, as you've said, more so of the later Middle Ages than we know from the sources, which are sources reflecting a conflictual relationship.
Okay, this is a very interesting question. What evidence exists that poetry within the Hebrew Bible, so biblical poetry, may have influenced Muslim, I guess the question is about Arabic poetry, may have influenced Arabic poetic production in style and content?
The question has to do with influence of biblical poetry on Arabic poetry.
I believe that's, yeah, that's how I'm interpreting the question, yes.
You know, that's a good question. I don't know of any examples of that kind of influence. I don't know to what extent, and I doubt that Muslim scholars had a deep awareness of the content of the Hebrew Bible and of Hebrew poetry, whereas for Jews, it was precisely the opposite. They knew Hebrew, they knew Arabic poetry, they knew the structure of the Arabic poetical system, and they applied it to their own, as I mentioned in my talk. But the reverse directional influence is something I myself am not aware of. Seems doubtful to me.
Okay, now we have another question about the jizya, which is helpful to clarify. So the question is, going back to the jizya, quote, it's a discriminatory tax if it's higher than what Muslims paid and if it did not benefit Jews. Please verify that this is the case.
Well, the question of whether it was more higher than taxes paid by Muslims, it's very difficult to say. It was not as much of a financial burden on the commercial and wealthier taxes in the Jewish community as it was on the poor. That's why I wrote about poverty and charity in the Jewish community in the Middle Ages, to show how the richer Jews who could more easily pay the poll tax also asserted themselves in helping to defray the poll tax of the poorer Jews. So it was a heavy discrimination for the poor, less so for the commercial, military, commercial segments of the Jewish community.
If it's okay with you, Mark, I want to just add, I think there's a point that you may have mentioned when you first introduced the poll tax that maybe is getting lost, I'm not sure. So I just want to explain that this was a head tax, meaning all Jews had to pay the same amount, whether they were destitute or not. And so it ended up imposing a very large burden on impoverished Jews, which was not the case for the Islamic charity taxes. And moreover, yes, as the questioner is pointing out, it did not benefit Jews, meaning this was a tax that Jews paid and then it didn't get redistributed back into the Jewish community. So I think that's part of what the questioner was alluding to. Okay, now a question dear to my heart. Could you speak more about the ways, sorry, this is by Naomi Jackson. Could you speak more about the ways in which Jewish women during this period engaged the Islamic courts, as you mentioned in your talk?
I'd love to bounce that back to you because you have written so much about
Certainly. Okay, so I should first of all say that the foremost scholar who is really working on this question is a former student of Mark's named Oded Zinger, who's at Hebrew University. But I also write about women. I've also touched on this topic, so I'm very happy to answer it. So the truth is that most of what we know about Jews' legal practices in this period, in the Geniza context specifically, comes from legal documents that ended up in the Geniza, most of which are from the Jewish courts. So it's kind of an indirect picture that we get of women and men going to the Qadi court, to the Islamic court. It's kind of just refracted through the Jewish court's legal records. That said, we know that people in general, men and women, used Islamic courts of law alongside Jewish courts of law for different purposes at the same time. And in general, this was accepted for many purposes when it came to, for example, documenting property transfers. The Jewish communal leaders had no problem at all with people going to the Qadi court. Where women appear as kind of a special case in this record is where women who are somewhat socially disenfranchised and don't really have any social capital or social power within the Jewish court often will try to gain leverage in the courtroom by threatening to go to an Islamic judge instead. And Oded has done some really amazing work cataloging these threats and their efficacy. So it's all kinds of cases where a woman, for example, is trying to gain part of an inheritance from her father or from her brother or even from her mother, and is being challenged by a relative, or a woman who's getting divorced and is fighting to regain some kind of financial repayment from her husband, but things are not going her way. It's a kind of common trope in these documents that she'll say, well, then I'm going to the Qadi. And it appears so often that it seems that it must have had, some efficacy. Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to add that Islamic legal scholars, some at least, accepted the presence of Jews, women or men, into the Islamic legal system or court system. They didn't discriminate against them. Any commercial conflicts between Jewish and, say, Christian or Jewish and Muslim merchants had to be, by definition, adjudicated in Muslim courts. It seems that Jews had a considerable amount of confidence in the Islamic court. We have an interesting Geniza letter in which there's a conflict between Jews, and the Qadi says he didn't want to rule on the matter until he had heard from, he says, the Rais, by which he meant the head of the Jews, who at that time was Maimonides. So there was interplay between Jewish judges and Muslim judges, and a kind of well-established confidence by Jewish leaders, at least in some Muslim courts, because of the generally positive relations between Jews and Muslims.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that are alluding to the same general phenomenon, so I'm going to condense them into one. The question is basically whether, well, it's a variation on the question you already answered about convivencia, whether current events cast a shadow on scholarship. So one of the questions is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict casts an overbearing shadow on US scholarship about Jewish-Islamic relations? And if Jewish Christianity has supplanted the formerly held European allusions to historically Arab-Jewish Semitic bonds?
Well, I'm going to answer the first part because I've written about it. In the 19th century, Jewish scholarship looked very favorably on the Jewish Muslim or the Jewish experience in the Muslim world. In the 20th century, particularly the mid-20th century, there's been a twist and turn in this direction because of perceived Islamic anti-Jewish feelings and anti-Jewish relations. There's developed what I call the counter myth, which sees Islam as persecutory of the Jews from the very, very beginning, from the time of Muhammad, and cherry picks evidence of Muslim enmity towards the Jews from the sources. I have to add here that Islamic sources or historical sources, chronicles, etc., rarely mention the non-Muslims unless there is a conflict between them. That does create a kind of illusion of Muslim anti-Semitism, which really should not be compared with Christian anti-Semitism as reflected in Christian sources in Europe. So the past does influence the perception of the present affects the perception of the past.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, and there's a very good one about the use of Judeo-Arabic. So why did so many Jewish intellectuals adopt Judeo-Arabic for writing instead of Hebrew or Arabic, in Arabic script, that is?
Well, fundamentally, it begins with language as spoken. Jews adopted the Arabic language in the same way that they have adopted the language of the surroundings wherever they have lived, as for instance, Aramaic in the Sasanian Empire. So Jews spoke Arabic. When they wrote in the language that they spoke. It doesn't mean that they didn't continue to write in religious texts in the Hebrew language, but what is so interesting is that they composed religious texts such as responsive literature in Arabic, which was the language that the average Jew could understand, whereas understanding ancient Hebrew was difficult. Jews even had need for Arabic in order to understand the Hebrew Bible. The great scholar, 10th century Saadia Gaon, translated the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, into Arabic, and that Arabic was read by Jews in the synagogue along with Hebrew, and it was evidently or obviously necessary for their comprehension of this important fundamental Jewish text.
Okay. I think we've run out of time. Since this is not a question, it's just a footnote comment, I will add that somebody added to the chat, wanted to underscore that there is a rich corpus of pre-Islamic classical Arabic poetry. That was, I guess, a footnote to the question about the Hebrew Bible and poetry. And with that, we're going to end this session. I want to thank you so much to Professor Cohen for the wonderful talk and for patiently and excellently answering all the many questions. It was really an interesting discussion. Thank you so much. And I will pass the baton over with that.